Okay. So right now, for those of you guys out there in virtual land, you should be able to see my screen. It says Introduction to Human Body. Please let me know if you do not have that. That's the lecture I gave you guys on Monday. For those of you who were not here on Monday and watched, hopefully you've gotten it. If you didn't, go ahead and grab it. I've already made copies for those of you who are here of your next lecture. We'll get to that on Friday. That's the self lecture that you also would have picked up, or you guys can get yours on Friday. And then the study guide, which will be used kind of at your own personal, however you want to do it. You don't have to turn that into me or anything like that. It's just to help get you ready for that first exam. So I try to get that to you guys quick into the unit. That way, if you want, you can start, filling it out if you do it that way, or if you just want to read through it. It's just kind of a good guide to help you get going and get you ready for that exam. So it's available on Canvas. So if you guys that aren't here today want to get it and print it off before then, you can, or I'll have them on Friday for you. So, okay, let's lecture. All right, first thing I want to do this semester, this is how I always open. Talk about this picture that's here on the first page. Anybody seen this picture before, or a picture like this before? Some of you shaking your head, yes. Okay, I imagine everybody's come across it, whether they knew it or not. You see it a lot in hospitals. Sometimes you'll see it in textbooks, especially if it's a science book, like an anatomy, physiology book. Ours doesn't have it. But this is the Vitruvian Man. He was first drawn by a very famous fellow named Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is very well known for being an artist. He's also just a super stud inventor and just a genius scientist. He was super interested in the human body and how it relates to like the physical world. In the natural world, he was concerned with like measurements and that kind of stuff. He's not really something that we talk a lot about this class, but he's kind of our mascot and a mascot for medicine as a whole. So that's why I include him. If you want to learn about the Vitruvian Man, you can check him out on Wikipedia. Does that help if I turn that light? All right, let's dive in on actual stuff to fill in your notes. If you flip to your second page there, and I apologize, I meant to double-side it, but I failed apparently when I was using the printer the other day. So hopefully that'll be the last time you have non-front and back. Okay, in this class, human anatomy, obviously, we're going to be studying anatomy. So I want to first just define what that is. That's one of the two branches of science. It's a division of biology, really, that area of science, that deals with the understanding of our body's parts and how we function. Okay. The key word to go with anatomy, and that's why you had to write it in, is structure. Okay. Identification and understanding of how we're built, essentially. Okay. Being able to identify the parts of the brain, parts of the eye, parts of the skin, parts of the cell. These are all things you guys are going to learn about in this class, okay, which we can do at many different levels. Okay, at the kind of highest level that I can do right now, what you guys can do with each other and with myself is look around at each other and see. We all have different shades of hair and shades of skin color, different colors of eyes. We can see these things about each other. These features are visible to each other with our naked eye. That's what gross anatomy is. Not gross as in, ooh, it's yucky, sick, nasty. Gross in this case means big. Okay. Whereas on Friday, when we start talking about cells, these are things we can't see on one another. These are things that you have to use a microscope to look at them. That's what we call microscopic anatomy. Okay, very, very tiny stuff. Okay, like cells and tissues. Now, in this class, and you guys are going to get exposed to this today, and really throughout the entire semester, what you're going to come to realize is that this class is like learning a new language. Okay, a lot of terms in here, and really in all science classes, are rooted from the language Latin. Okay, And so, most of you probably don't know how to speak and read Latin. But you're going to learn a lot of words that are based in Latin. Okay, we see two words here in that sentence, cytology and histology. Okay, they end the same way with the suffix ology, like biology and psychology. Anybody know what ology means? It means study of, absolutely. Okay. So I bet you can figure out what cyto means. Study of cells. Cyto means cells. Bet you can figure out what histo means. Tissues. Okay. When you put the ology at the end, then it's the study of. Okay. Our textbook, the textbook I said you guys probably would never have to use, has a list of these prefixes and suffixes in the back. Great thing about you guys and us now, we have fancy cell phones. You can type a word into Google and have it instantly tell you what it is, where it comes from, what it means. Okay. If you come across these words, Google it. You don't understand what it means, or you can kind of just break them apart into their different parts. Okay. Don't just skip the word if you don't know what it means. Figure it out. Okay. Comparative anatomy. This is something done by biologists and those that are concerned with like evolution, kind of comparing how one organism relates to another and how they're built. Okay. Interestingly enough, like we all look very similar embryonically, like to a chicken and to like lizards. We have tails. It's really hard to tell us apart from those organisms. Pretty crazy, but that's the truth. Okay. In this class, and I mentioned this the other day, we're also going to study a little bit about physiology. Now, here at Highland, we teach them independently of one another. I teach a physiology class at 10 o'clock. And in that class, we also talk a little bit about anatomy, because these two things go hand in hand. Anatomy is a lot of pinpointing and memorization. Okay, looking at a picture and describing the parts. Physiology, you take that and you amplify it to then having to understand how that structure works. So physiology, think function. Okay, a little more complicated. At least most students would say so. Okay, just like anatomy, we can look at it at different levels. For example, you could study human physiology. Obviously, that's what we're going to do. We're also, we're not going to talk about plant physiology. Okay. Organizational level study could include things like molecular, cellular physiology. What we do is, for the most part, we go system by system, looking at systemic anatomy and systemic physiology, like respiratory or cardiovascular anatomy phys. Which, if you look at the table down here at the bottom, on the left side, they have several branches of anatomy listed, several branches of physiology listed. These are not things that I would ask you to know. I include it because there's any textbook. Oops. All right. Now, when I go through these lectures, what I try to do is let you guys write, fill in the blanks, and then I'll try to talk. Okay. So if I start talking before you're ready and you need me to hang on, just say, hey, hold up. I don't want to get going without you hearing what I'm saying. And if I need to zoom in, just let me know. I can always do that as well. Yes, sir. Need a pen? Okay, I'm going to go back up to the top. If you didn't get all those, don't worry, I'll be back down bottom here in just a second. Okay. One thing I want to talk about on this page is just really kind of introduce you to how complex, but how intricately and amazingly we're put together. Really, all living things are. Now, we happen to be super complex. We're multicellular. We've got organs, and we're one of the most complex species in the world. And even bacteria, which are single-celled organisms, are complex in their own right. And regardless if you're looking at a fairly simple but still complex bacteria, or us as a human, we're all put together in a very coordinated manner. And we can look at the way that we're built in a way that we call the levels of organization. Okay. At the simplest, we have at the top the chemical level. The very bottom, we've got 6 levels, the 6th being us as the organism. Okay. It might help to keep this straight that if you write on the side of the page, up at the top, we're looking at the simplest and then draw narrow down to the most complex at the bottom. And we're building up from simple to big. Now, in this class, we don't talk a lot about the chemical level, which a lot of students breathe a sigh of relief, because this is where you're talking about chemistry, atoms, and molecules, okay, electrons and protons and neutrons, stuff I cover in my physiology class, but I don't cover in this class. But still important to introduce it at least here today. Okay, so let's talk about atoms. Some small particles with unique identities. Okay, and I imagine most of you have taken a class where you had to look at the periodic table of elements. Okay, that big table with boxes all over the place and lots of letters and numbers. Each of those boxes represents a different element you find in the physical world. Okay. And for example, there are 4 of those, and it's a big box, it's a big table, I should say. Really, 4 of those from that big table make up like 96% of us. And that's what I always tell students to remember: CHON. CHON is not an element, but carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are. And notice they're listed right here. C-H-O-N. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen make up like 96% of us. Each of those boxes in the periodic table represents what one atom of that element would be. And so it tells you how many protons, how many electrons, how many neutrons are in it. And I said 96% of us are those 4 elements. You can't just crack us open and pull out the carbon. You can't just pull out the hydrogen, because you don't just have elements in our body in their simple atom form. What we have are those atoms joined together in a specific manner to form what we call molecules. Molecules are at least 2 types of atoms joined together. Okay. Like H2O, which we best know as what? Water. And glucose, C6H12O6. DNA, proteins. Those are all examples of very important to us living organisms of molecules. Okay. Other elements important in our body, you can see I've got phosphorus listed. Calcium, we all know calcium is a strong component in our bones. Sulfur, there's potassium, there's chloride, and others we don't really get into. Okay. Those molecules that make us up, like the water, the DNA I just mentioned, are then combined and form bigger structures called organelles. I mean, you've ever heard the term powerhouse of the cell? Anybody? Yes. Everybody says that when they're in high school biology as a high school biology teacher. The powerhouse of a cell is called a mitochondria. Okay, that's an example of an organelle that performs a specific function inside of our cells. Other examples include ribosomes, the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum. These are things we'll talk about next time when we talk about cells. And we're at number 2, cells. The cellular level, cells are described as the smallest and most numerous structural units, possessing and exhibiting the basic characteristics of living matter. Okay, some organisms like that bacteria I was talking about are a single cell, and that's it. Okay, that's as complex as they are. We are super complex. We began our life as a single cell, and here we are as adults, fully grown, made up of trillions upon trillions of cells. And that one cell became two, which became four, which became on and on and on and on and on. Okay? And each of those cells has a specific function. Those functions are a result of those organelles that I was just mentioning. Okay? You take a group of cells and you can make a tissue. There we're at number 3. Tissues are a group of similar cells, typically developed together, collectively kind of perform a special function. Okay? 4 principal types of tissues exist in the body: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. Okay? Epithelial is what forms like the outer layer of our skin, inside of our mouth. It forms our sweat glands. It's inside of our stomach. Okay? Connective does what it sounds like. It connects. Your bones are made up of connective tissue. Ligaments and tendons. Your blood's actually a connective tissue. So is your fat. Okay? So there's a lot of diversity in functions when it comes to connective. Muscle helps us move. Obviously, as you guys write, you're contracting your skeletal muscles. Okay? But you're also pumping your heart to circulate blood throughout your body. So we don't just move our whole body, we move stuff inside of us. And then nervous is what is the most complex. And that's because it forms our brain and spinal cord, performing nerve impulses called action potentials for rapid communication. You can take at least 2 of those, and you can build organs, like that brain I just mentioned, like our stomach that I've mentioned. Okay, and now we're at the organ level. And organ, yeah, absolutely. So an organ is described as a structure made up of several different types of tissue, and it says that at least 2 joined together that can then allow for a specific function to occur. And organs can come together and form systems. There we're at the 5th level, like the digestive system, urinary system, reproductive system. And the way that we operate this semester is really, here these first 3 lectures we're kind of building up, and then we'll hit our first system. And there are 11 systems that we're going to talk about in this class. We'll talk about one system, get all the way through it, then we'll move on to the next. Eventually, we'll have talked about all 11 systems, which means that we've talked about the entire organism, us, the human, at the 6th level, the sum total of all those structural levels working together. So, illustration here at the bottom I've included from the textbook. Gives you a nice flow chart to build up from that small level where we had those carbons, hydrogen, oxygens, and nitrogens, the atoms I was talking about. Now, I told you guys the other day that in this class, we're going to be doing a lot of identification, pointing things out in pictures, knowing things from pictures. Okay. If a picture is in your lecture, unless I tell you otherwise, you can assume you need to know it for the exam. Okay. This is an example of a picture that I'm not going to have you worry about for the exam in a couple weeks. So you don't have to cross it out or anything, but you might go, don't study, because I'm not going to ask you to know it. I included it just to kind of help illustrate what we're talking about. All right, as I mentioned just a second ago, I said we're going to build up here for these first 3 lectures, and then we're going to go system by system. Some systems, remember, a system is a group of organs collectively work together towards a common goal. Okay. Some systems we spend several lectures. Some we have 1 lecture and that's it. So we get in a little more complex with things. Others not so much. Okay. The table here that I included gives you the system. That's the column that you guys are filling in right now. In the middle is a list of organs that belong to that system. You might see some organs belong to multiple systems. Like the pancreas, you'll see a couple of different places because it functions for 2 different systems. And then on the far right is the absolute most brief general description of what that system as a whole does. This is just to introduce you to those systems and get an idea of what we're going to be studying as we really get to rolling this semester. Okay. I'm not going to read through it all. I included it in the exact same order that we go. The first system we're going to talk about, we'll get into it next week, the integumentary system. It's where your skin belongs to, your fingernails and your hair, those kinds of things. Okay. All the way down to the very end of the semester when we talked about the reproductive organs. Is everybody good? Okay, give you a couple more seconds here to finish writing them out. All right, moving on. Everybody good? Finally, some actual anatomy stuff to talk about and to look at. We have a couple pictures at the bottom. Okay, talking anatomical position. One thing that we do a lot of in this class is describe the location of things. Okay, where something's at, where things are related as far as, in relationship to one another, where they're at. We'll talk about directional terms on the next page. So when you describe something, it has to be described where you can, how do I want to say this? Have a base point. Okay. So that, we can describe something as being above or below. We need a starting point. And that's what anatomical position really is. Okay. We have here on the bottom of the page a picture of a lady standing perfectly, or she could be laying if she's on an imaginary table, in anatomical position. See, with anatomical position, the face is pointed straight forward, so you're not turned one way or the other with your head. Your feet are pointed straight ahead. Feet are at your width of your shoulder, somewhere in that neighborhood. Arms are down by your side with the palms of your hands facing forward. Okay, that's perfect anatomical position. And that way, when we go to describe something as being above or in front of or below, we have a starting point. Okay. Now, if we pretend she's laying on a table, the picture on the left, we'd say she's in a supine position. Okay, so if you sleep on your back, you sleep in a supine position. Okay, if you sleep on your stomach, you sleep in a prone position. Okay, and that's what we could say the picture on the right side of the page is. And the lady's laying prone. Okay. Now, in our 2 pictures here, we've got different parts of the body labeled. Okay, you'll see two different things labeled for each arrow. Okay, a traditional term like elbow or head, thigh, terms that we learn like 1 or 2. I mean, this is the stuff I'm doing with my 2-year-old. I ask him, "Where's your eyes?" He points to them. Everybody knows where your eyes are. Okay. You'll also see another term. The term that's not in parentheses is the anatomical term. Okay. These are the terms that we use in this class. This is what doctors use, nurses use, instead of elbow, instead of thigh. And so this can be the part of the day, the first time you're probably going to groan under your breath, maybe audibly out loud, say, "Holy crap." These terms, you're absolutely going to need to know them. These pictures, you're absolutely going to need to know them. I can guarantee you'll see these pictures, at least one of the two, on your exam. Okay. There will be questions on your exam where I ask you, what's the anatomical term for the back of the elbow? And then you'd have like multiple choice set of answers to pick from. And here's an illustration of why this is important. And this is what I do every semester. I say, "Okay, everybody point to your biceps muscle." You guys can all do that at home. So point to your biceps muscle. Everybody knows where your biceps is, right? Okay, now point to your other one, but don't point to your other arm. Exactly. Okay. You all know what your biceps muscle is in your arm. That muscle is called the biceps brachii. It's known as the biceps brachii because it's found in the brachial region. Guess what the name of the nerve in that area is? Guess what the name of the vein and the artery? Those are all the brachial, whatever. Brachial artery, brachial vein, brachial nerve. Brachialis muscles also up there. Okay. Biceps brachii. Where is your biceps femoris muscle? It's in your femoral region, which is where you find the femoral artery and the femoral vein. The femur, your thigh. Okay. I'm sure you've all heard of hamstrings before, right? There's 3 muscles that make up each hamstring. One of those is the biceps femoris. It's the back of your leg, upper leg, that is. So if you learn these terms now, and yes, it will be a challenge, but it's going to help you all semester long. Because you'll be able to remember, oh yeah, brachial region is my upper arm. That's got to be where the brachial artery is. So if you put in the work now, it'll help you all semester long. Now, if I were, and yes, I'm going to put one or maybe both of these pictures on the exam, what I would never do is give you the picture and say, okay, label it completely front to back, and you don't have anything to go from. Okay, what I do for pictures a lot of times is I put the picture on there, blank, and I give you, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, of those terms right there, and I'd say draw an arrow in and label it with these terms. Put the arrow where it's supposed to go. Or I have it labeled already with arrows. You put the term where it's supposed to go. Something like that. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm hard, but I'm not too hard, I promise. Commit them to memory and you will benefit tremendously, I promise. All right, let's talk about describing body structures. Okay, where things are located in relationship to one another is something that's very important. Okay, like I said, we use that anatomical position so that we can have that starting point, and then we have some other words to go along with describing them. We don't like to use terms like in front of and below, behind. Instead, they've got these directional terms. Okay. Now, I think I forgot to mention this the other day, but one thing I like to do at various points in the semester is kind of try to make pictures come alive by coloring them. Okay. especially like when we talk about blood vessels. For example, that brachial artery that I was talking about. When it's in your upper arm, that's a brachial artery. But when it's up in your shoulder, it's a different artery. It's the same vessel, it just has a different name where it's at. So if you color one green, the other one blue, it makes it stand out. And now, what I tell students to do, go to Dollar General, Walmart, pick up like a 20-pack of colored pencils, because I will color, and that'll help, hopefully, if you're a visual learner, tremendously as we lecture. Okay? Obviously, you didn't know that, so don't worry. We won't do it for a while anyway. But if you wanted to, you could color some arrows in this picture and this one over here. This letter A arrow represents the first directional term, superior. Superior is the term I use more often than the other terms there you got. Let's see, cranioencephalic, I rarely, if ever, use. So maybe just worry so much about superior. Okay, it means towards the head. Whereas the opposite of that would be inferior, towards the feet. Okay? So if I put this in a sentence, okay, the hip is blank to your knees. What would you put in? Superior, inferior? Superior. Superior is closer to your head. Your knees are inferior to your hip. Make sense? Okay. I don't really care for caudal. I don't really use that very often either. So superior, inferior, and that would be what letter H is. Okay, so those are opposite one another. So are anterior and posterior. I also do want you to know ventral and dorsal here. Okay, anterior means towards the front, or in front of. Posterior, like, people call their butt, their posterior, posterior. Okay. So your butt's probably the most posterior part of your body. Okay. Also dorsal, the fin of a shark that sticks out of water when it's, chasing you down. Hopefully it never happens to you. That's the dorsal fin of a shark. Okay. It's on its back. Okay. So which arrow would it be, B or C for anterior? This is anterior, C is posterior. Medial lateral. So I tell students for this one, imagine that there's an imaginary line going right down through the top of your head, through your nose, down through your groin and your belly button. So perfectly straight down the middle. Okay, the closer you are to that line, the more to the middle you are. Which of those words sounds like middle? Medial. Okay. And then lateral would be towards the sides. Okay, farther from the midline. So D would be medial, E would be lateral. Okay. So fill in this sentence. The heart is blank to your lungs. Is it medial or is it lateral? Medial. Okay. Now you could also use this term instead, and that's the next one, intermediate. Because your heart is between your lungs. We rarely use intermediate, and I don't even have an arrow in those pictures for it. Okay, but that's another term. I also don't have pictures or arrows for the next two, and that's because we rarely use those. Ipsilateral, contralateral. I can't even think of a time we use them outside this slide. Ipsilateral means around the same side of the body, so like your right ankle is ipsilateral to your right shoulder. Your left ankle is contralateral to your right shoulder, opposite sides of the body. Proximal, distal, those a lot of times are describing parts of a limb, so like your arms, your legs. Think distal, distant, proximal, closer to where the limb begins. Where does a limb begin? Either your shoulders or your hips, right? Okay. So let's view this. Your elbow is blank to your wrist. Your elbow is proximal, it's closer to your shoulder, right? Then your wrist, which is farther away, distal, distant. Okay. Now, if you were given a choice of that same sentence, instead of saying proximal, you could also say your elbow is superior to your wrist, because your elbow is closer to your head, right? So sometimes it's just kind of dependent upon what you're being asked to look at. So letter F would be proximal, G would be distal. The last two, hopefully, are pretty common sense. I and J, I would be superficial, closer to the exterior of the body, so your skin. Superficial, everything is deep to your skin. And then external, internal, hopefully they're common sense. Picture on the left is from your textbook, kind of shows some of those same things. I'm not the biggest fan of it. The one on the right, or the two on the right, I guess, I pulled from a different textbook. I kind of like them a little bit better, but I promise you none of these images will be on your exam. Okay, a couple more that weren't in the table that we do use. I'll let you write them out. Okay, let's talk about lumen. That's the first one there, refers to the hollow area of an organ. A lot of organs inside our body are hollow structures. Think of them kind of like a balloon. Your stomach is a great example. You know, it's right at lunchtime, or a lot of you probably ate right before this. Where that food goes is the lumen of your stomach. The blood that's pumping through your arteries and veins found in the lumen of that organ. Okay. Central, peripheral, probably fairly common sense word. Central means to the center of an organ, peripheral towards the boundary. Okay, so if you're looking at this organ, central will be here, peripheral towards the outside. Probably less commonly heard, probably never even heard of them, are medullary and cortical. Those are the adjective forms. Medulla and cortex are the noun forms. Okay, you guys probably all heard of adrenaline, right? Adrenaline is a hormone that makes us really amped up. Okay? Adrenaline rush makes you run fast. Okay? Makes us do crazy things. That's produced by an organ called the adrenal gland. There's two parts here, adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla, which is the middle part. That's where the hormone adrenaline actually comes from. The adrenal cortex is the outside. And that's where a whole bunch of other hormones are coming from. Okay. The last two, basal and apex, apical and then base and apex, refer to this triangle that I put over here. Notice it's put not like a normal triangle. Typically, when you draw a triangle, you put the fat part on the bottom and the point at the top, right? The reason I did it that way, because that's actually what your heart looks like inside your body. The base of your heart, the widest part, is actually on top. The apex is on the bottom. It's called an inverted triangle, and it's actually cockeyed like this, points from our right shoulder down to our left hip. There's several organs that are triangular in shape. Your lungs are an example of that as well. All right, let's talk about body planes. Body planes are defined as an imaginary flat surface that passes through the body. Think of them like a pane of glass. And that's kind of what they look like down here in our picture at the bottom left. Okay. The first plane is called a sagittal plane. There's actually two forms of them shown here. These blue lines, mid-sagittal, parasagittal. They are vertical planes, so they run up and down, and they divide the body into left and right sides. Okay, so they run from front to back. So all you see in that picture is a line, but if you turn the body 90 degrees, it would be the whole plane like you see for the frontal plane. Okay. The difference between mid-sagittal and parasagittal is where it runs through the body. If it runs down the middle, there's the mid-sagittal plane. Okay, creates equal left and right sides. Parasagittal, unequal sides, left and right sides. The next one is the frontal plane. I always call it the frontal plane. It's also known as coronal plane. Runs vertically and divides the body, and this is an easy way to remember it. Frontal because it creates front and back. Or as we just learned, anterior and posterior halves to the body. Okay. The next one, transverse plane, also known as cross-sectional horizontal plane. I always call it transverse. Anytime you see trans, that prefix means across or through, and you'll see the term transverse a lot. Think of it like this: sideways, horizontally running, and it creates upper and lower, superior and inferior portions to the body. The final plane, oblique, is neither vertical nor horizontal, it's somewhere in the middle. We rarely talk about oblique planes, but it is another type of plane. Okay. Now, those are different ways to look at the body, different angles if you want to think of it that way. You can, if you're in a lab, perform a dissection along one of those planes, which we may or may not do, depending on if we do any dissection, but you will have that opportunity in the virtual lab. We do dissect the brain, we will perform a mid-sagittal section where we cut the brain into equal left and right sides. And so a section is just a cut along that brain. Frontal section, cut the front of the brain off. Transverse section, you see, is where you're cutting the top of the brain off and then looking down. And I'm not so concerned with the pictures on the right, but I do want you to know the picture on the left. So make sure you know her. Earlier, I talked about how incredibly organized we were by way of those levels of organization. Okay? All those organs that we've been talking about are put in places, and that's also another example of how well organized we are and how well put together we are. Most of our organs are found within these body cavities. Spaces within the body that protect, separate, and support our internal organs. Okay? Now, there's two categories for these cavities: anterior or ventral, which means that they're towards the front of the body, as we just learned what anterior and ventral mean. And then the two that are posterior dorsal, which are closer to the back of the body. Okay. Let's talk about the thoracic cavity first. We can see here in our lateral view from the side, anterior view from the front. This is where your chest is, and that's why it's also known as the chest cavity. Okay, 3 major organs exist here: your lungs and your heart. Not the only organs, but those are some of the more important ones in there. Probably the most important ones in there. Okay. Now, those 3 organs aren't just hanging out and floating around in there. They're enclosed by some membranes. And so there's actually smaller cavities that aren't shown in this picture or these pictures where those organs are. Around each lung is a pleural cavity. Anytime you see the word pleura or pleural, refers to lungs. Anytime you see cardia or cardiac, it refers to heart. Like pericardial, that cavity refers to the space around our heart. There's also a imaginary spot right in the middle of that thoracic cavity, okay, and that's called the mediastinum. Okay, not something I'm going to point out or anything specific. That's the upper cavity. The much larger lower cavity is the green one here, the abdominal pelvic cavity. To separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have an organ. Actually, well, it is an organ, but it's a muscle called the diaphragm. That's the muscle that helps us breathe. And it's an actual structure that separates those 2 cavities. And the abdominal pelvic cavity is home to big organs, lots of organs, intestines and liver and spleen, kidneys. Okay. It's such a big cavity, they actually subdivide it. And you can see a dotted line going across here, creating what we call the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Now that dotted line represents the fact that there's not an actual true divider, just an imaginary line. The 2 posterior cavities include the vertebral cavity or canal found within our vertebrae, and that's where your spinal cord is. Cranial cavity found within your skull where your brain is. Okay. Now, to protect our brain and spinal cord from those hard bony bones are 3 layers of tissue called meninges. We'll talk about those later on in the semester. Organs of our thoracic cavity and abdominal pelvic cavity, collectively we can call those organs viscera. So if you ever see the term viscera or visceral, which you happen to see here on this next page, that means related to an organ of those 2 cavities. So your stomach's viscera, lungs, intestines, spleen, kidneys, those are all viscera, just internal organs. All right, since it's 12:50, we're going to just pick up with this on Friday. So on Friday, those of you who are in front of me right now, you'll be at home or at the library, wherever you're going to dial in from. Those of you who are in virtual land, I will see you in person. I think I got everybody marked down that was not here as in out there in virtual land. Let me take roll for those of you who are in person so I can get that noted down. Kanae, Kayla. Which one's Kayla? You, Kayla? Perla. Did I say that right? Malia? Is it Malia or is it Malia? Okay. Anna. Diedrich. Kyler. Shane. And then, are you Arthur? Okay, we'll talk real quick before I sneak you out of here. Everybody else, you guys are free to go. So same with you guys. I got everybody, I think. So I will see you all on Friday. Have a fantastic rest of your day.